Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. People across Africa were living well until the 19th century when European colonialists took over most of the continent. These outsiders redirected the natural resources to enhance their own wealth. Now that the occupiers are gone, the new governments are still sending wealth offshores into personal foreign bank accounts. Our guest today has ideas for how Africa can hang on to its own riches, starting in the village square. My guest today is George Ayittey, economist at American University and president of the Free Africa Foundation. He has written several books on Africa and economic development, including Africa Unchained, the blueprint for Africa's future. Welcome, George.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Glad to have you here. It seems a little strange to talk about Africa as one place or one culture. It's such a big continent, and yet you do talk about it as a single entity.
Well, not necessarily as a single entity. I mean, we have 54 African countries in Africa. They all facing common problems.
Common problems?
Yeah, so of course there are exceptions to the rule. There are some countries which are doing well, but the vast majority of the countries on the continent are not doing very well.
And in terms of cultural heritage, do they share more than they differ?
There are commonalities in terms of the culture. Africa has a very, very rich heritage and cultural heritage. But I think, you know, when you go back to the days of colonialism, Africa was portrayed as some sort of a backward continent which had no history, had no culture, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, this was to justify colonialism. But you know, when you step back and you look at Africa's own history, there's rich cultural heritage that are there. For example, you know, there were empires in Africa, and of course, there were such things as markets in Africa. I mean, markets were ubiquitous across Africa.
Right, pretty complex economic systems.
In traditional Africa, the means of production are privately owned. They're not owned by tribal governments or tribal chiefs. They're privately owned. Whenever any profit is made, okay, the profit goes to the family, doesn't go to the chief.
Before colonialism.
Before the colonialists came to Africa. And this is what I've been writing about. The greatest mistake that our leaders made after independence from colonial rule was never to go back and build upon our own indigenous institutions.
But had it been too long, colonialism begins in what, the 17th century? The Dutch come in, 18th, 19th century, and so it had been a few centuries. Did people simply not remember?
Well, no, the institutions are still there in traditional Africa. We still have chiefs in Africa. We still have kings in Africa. We still have village markets in Africa. Okay. Now, the problem is, even in our own indigenous institutions, we had political systems of participatory democracy. Now, let me explain this. If you take a village, and a village is made up of 10 extended families, each extended family will have a head, and the 10 heads will come together to form a council of elders. They will choose a chief, okay? Now, those are the two units of the village government, the chief and the council of elders. The third is the village assembly. Now, in governance, the chief and the councillors have to come to unanimous verdict on all important decisions. If they couldn't, they will call a village meeting and put the issue before the people. Now, the people will debate the issue until they come to a consensus. Now, this is important. Once a consensus is reached, everybody in the village, including the chief, is required to abide by it, okay? Now, the reason why this is important is because there are two ways in which you can take democratic decisions. The first one is according to the Western model of majority vote, where you count votes. How many people are for a certain particular proposition? How many are against? You count. It is fast, it's sufficient, but it has a downside.
You always have losers.
Yeah, the downside is you can ignore the decision, you can ignore the views of the minority, okay? The other way by which you can take democratic decisions is by consensus. Consensus means that you take all minority positions into account in order to reach a consensus. Now, the advantage here is that once you reach a consensus, you can be sure that everybody will go along with that.
Everyone's on board.
Yeah, everyone is on board. But it has a downside. The downside
it takes forever.
Yeah, I mean, the larger the number of people, it can take forever, okay? Now, in traditional Africa, we reach our decisions by consensus. The very fact that there was no ballot box there didn't mean that traditional Africans had no idea what democracy was, okay? Now, after independence, we didn't go back to that particular model. Now, the thing is, you see, in traditional Africa, in certain tribal societies, okay, the unit is not an individual.
Right.
Okay, it is the collective. Okay, so you can create a system where in a council of elders, for example, where you have heads of various extended families reach a decision, okay, you can also create a system in which heads of various tribal groups in a country, for example, or the heads of, say, political groups, for example, can come to a consensus.
Right.
Okay, and that's how you build upon what is already there. Okay, but we didn't do that in many parts in Africa. We introduced political systems. And you see, back in the 1960s, this is the way African leaders argued. They said, well, now that we have our independence, we want to establish a political system. But we don't want to have democracy because democracy is a Western institution, which was totally...
And so they were trying to reject what had been imposed
totally
upon
false.
them.
Okay. Democracy is a Western institution, and it's a luxury which Africa cannot afford. And therefore, we must have a political system which only one political party, in which all the African people will belong, so that we don't have tribal politics. Okay? And what system did they choose? They chose the one-party socialist system, which was copied, okay, from the former Soviet Union and from the East.
Right.
It had no affinity whatsoever, none, with our own traditional African political institutions.
So it wasn't European, but it also wasn't African.
It wasn't African.
And so it didn't...
Okay, so it's like, you know, you don't like one particular, you don't like one particular foreign system, but then you copy another foreign system to impose upon the people.
How many countries did that? Was it most of Africa that went that direction?
Many of them. Between 1960 and 1990, out of the 54 African countries, only 4 of them were multi-party democracies. Did
they influence each other? Were there Marxist influences coming in to try to shape this?
Well, this is where, you know, the mythology about Africa had a huge influence. Okay? Now, the colonialists didn't know about Africa's rich political heritage and cultural heritage.
Right.
And the most annoying thing was that the leadership itself didn't know either.
Right. I mean, I understand Europeans coming in and being oblivious to the culture that was already there.
But the leadership, and that's where my anger is, the leadership also didn't understand their own indigenous cultural heritage. Only Botswana was the only black African country which went back and built upon its own indigenous institutions, which is why Botswana is doing very well.
Yeah. Why didn't they know? How? I mean, do you see it as a sort of willful forgetfulness, or were they never educated?
Well, of course, we're not taught about our own indigenous institutions in the colonial schools.
Sure.
To be honest with you, I myself didn't know about them until I came to America, and I went to, and then I started doing my own research into these institutions.
You grew up in Ghana.
Yeah, I grew up in Ghana. But the main important point was that democracy and development, you cannot pursue that by ignoring the local cultures. Culture has everything to do with economic development.
You can count very few leaders that you would call effective or good right now in Africa.
Since 1960, we have had about 209 African heads of state. Out of that 209 African heads of state, fewer than 15 can be said to be good, clean leaders. Very few. Okay? So, which means that the vast majority of the leadership just failed, were just utter failures. Okay? Now, this doesn't mean that leadership failure is unique to Africa alone, but it's just that, you know, Africa just has had a bumper crop of them, you know.
Have the current corrupt governments learned these bad habits from the European colonialists or from...
Oh, no, not necessarily. But you see, they created political systems in which a great deal of power was concentrated in their hands.
So it's irresistible.
Well, you see, they outlawed opposition parties. Okay, we created one-party state systems. And they took over the media, monopolized the media. Okay? Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. If you create a political system in which a lot of power has been concentrated in the hands of one individual, now that system, no matter where you are, will always degenerate into tyranny.
And he doesn't want to give that up.
And that's exactly what happened in many, many, many African countries. Now, you can't bring in colonialism into this because the African leaders created these defective systems themselves. When they had that power, concentrated that power in their hands, they used that power for three purposes. The first one was to enrich themselves, their cronies.
Personally, not their country, but themselves.
Their cronies and their tribesmen, and exclude everybody else. Now, the richest persons in Africa are always heads of state, the ministers. I mean, when quite often the chief bandit is the head of state himself. Now, the second purpose by which they monopolized and used that power for was to crush their political rivals and enemies. Okay? And the third was to perpetuate themselves in office. Okay? So what you had in many, many African countries on the political front was a sort of a political apartheid system. See, it wasn't only the whites in South Africa who were doing it.
Well, in some ways, I wonder if the bigger surprise is not that individuals are greedy and want individual power, but that a democracy could ever exist, that they don't simply claw their way and eliminate all opposition. And yet you say that today there are some young African people who are trying to change that, or who see an alternative vision.
What will save many African countries is just political reform. Okay? We sort of dismantle the sort of political apartheid system that we have, and do away with the politics of exclusion and implement politics of inclusion, and take power out of the hands of despicable despots and give it back to the people where it belongs.
How do you do that when the despots have the guns and the goons?
Well, I know. Now, remember I indicated that in 1990, out of the 54 African countries, only 4 of them were democratic.
Right.
Well, today the number has gone up a bit to 16.
Good.
Okay?
Good.
Well, 16 is... Well, it's progress, but in my view, it's not enough progress, because what it means is that the vast majority of the African people still live under oppressive tyranny.
Right.
The leadership are just not interested in reform, period.
Of course.
Okay? Why are they not interested in reform? Because they know they have done bad. They know their hands are dripping in blood and their pockets are full of booty. So they don't want to relinquish power, because if they step out of power, they know that all their gory misdeeds will be exposed.
Right.
So they think that the only way they can protect themselves is by clinging to power. But it doesn't work out in the long run. They spend an inordinate amount of money building up on the military and on the armies, but eventually they're overthrown by their own security forces. And they are shot in the head by their own security detail.
Because if you can't trust anyone, you can't trust anyone.
You know, if you look at history, okay, those that, serve their people, not their own personal interests, those that serve their people are those that became enduring heroes.
How the countries that have shifted, we've gone from 4 to 16 countries that are democracies. How have they accomplished that?
Well, one of them is Ghana. And in the case of Ghana, I was one of those architects of change in Ghana. And I mean, it was a very long, arduous, and relentless struggle against a military dictatorship that we had there. But the way we did it was, in fact, we did it without Western help. We did it without any foreign help. And the main reason why we were able to do it was because to corral the opposition groups together. Okay. Now, I hate to admit this, and I'll be frank with you. The despots and the dictators have dominated because the opposition in many, many, many African countries is hopeless. Okay. In too many countries, the opposition is fragmented, divided, and squabbling among themselves. Okay. And they themselves, they are themselves closet dictators.
Sure.
And they are no better than, the dictators they hope to replace. Okay. If you look at a country like Mali, for example, the opposition parties that are there are about 100. In Kenya, back in 2002, there were 26 opposition parties, all challenging one person. I mean, nothing delights a tyrant in power than to see a divided field.
Right, because they'll fight themselves instead of him.
Finally we pushed the Kenyan opposition parties to form together and come together and establish a orange democratic movement, okay, to contest, to challenge the incumbent in December 2007. But then guess what? 2 months before that vote, the Orange Democratic Movement split into two.
Well, so why does this break just before?
Personal lust, it's just a personal lust for power. Mm-hmm. And it is. And we encountered this problem in Ghana. Mm-hmm. And
but you somehow overcame that.
Well, the one factor or one reason why we were able to overcome that was I sort of convinced the opposition parties that, look, George Ayittey, I'm not interested in the presidency of the country. Mm-hmm. I'm not interested in any government post or ministerial, ambassadorial. I'm not interested in that. You don't
want power.
I didn't want power for anything. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that reassured them, and it was a lot easier for them, to work together with me and so forth. But in other countries, okay, there's always a suspicion that, if you work together with one particular opposition leader, he might stab you in the back. Both of them. Imagine when, opposition leaders are competing for the same throne, for example.
Does that mean that we need more people to come in from the outside and be mediators or encouragers, as you've done?
No, not necessarily. I think, if we can persuade them that, look, it's always, it's the fate of the country which is at stake. Right. You have to save Zimbabwe first before you think about, who should be the president.
When you say we have to persuade them,
well,
do you mean
I'm talking about Africans.
Yeah, you're in a unique position because yes. you're Ghanaian, you left, you've been away, you've come back with some perspective.
There's a sort of a huge tribal element in African politics. Mm-hmm. Especially, it's worse in Nigeria.
But so that's still strong, despite
it is still strong,
okay.
and the reason why it's still strong is not so much because of the African people, but it's because of their leadership. Mm-hmm. When a leader is unpopular and despotic, he tends to surround himself with members of his own tribe. Okay. And that leads Africans to believe that, well, look, if the leader is doing this, I don't belong to his tribe. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I might as well, for my own safety, I might as well hang around with my own tribal people.
That seems the remarkable thing to me then is that you don't end up with just constant inter-tribal warfare.
Sometimes it happens. Look at, Rwanda and Burundi, right. For example. If you take me in Zimbabwe, for example, I'm not a Shona, okay? And so when I say something, and I'm trying to say work with the opposition groups in Zimbabwe, they don't see me as a threat. Yeah. Because I'm not a...
You have no interest
No, I have no interest in...
Give me a picture of what it's going to take. Obviously a change in leadership and a shift back to democratic systems. But in terms of economic development, what do you see as the hope of the future of Africa?
Let's take any African economy, okay? You can divide any African economy into three parts. There is the modern sector. The modern sector is the abode of the elites. That modern sector is also the seat of government, okay? That modern sector is lost, okay? It has been the source.
You see no hope for that.
It has been the source of many of Africa's woes, okay? And it is run by the elites, okay? The second sector is the traditional sector, okay? Which is the home of agriculture, okay? And then in between those two is the informal sector, okay? Now, the traditional sector is the informal sector. It's where you find the vast majority of the African people.
And what do you mean by informal sector?
By informal sector, we mean things like, bakeries, bicycle repair. Okay. Those are the, stuff that in the modern sector, you have a formal economy where, you have payment slips and receipts, et cetera, okay? Wages are paid and so forth. In the informal sector, there's not so much, they're not used so much with paperwork.
There might be more bartering.
Yeah,
or,
but it's not so much formal.
Right. Okay.
In the traditional sector, that's where you might call the traditional sector the peasant economy. Okay. So the informal sector is something in between the two.
I see.
The vast majority of the African people can be found in the traditional and informal sector. So if the essence of development is uplifting the economic lot of the people, and if you have resources, you don't invest resources in the modern sector, you invest the resources in the informal and the traditional sectors.
So this is agriculture, small farms and small businesses.
Yeah. But those two sectors were precisely those sectors that we neglected. I mean, when I say we, I mean the African elites and leaders neglected after independence. They channeled much of the development resources into the modern sector because that's where they lived. Okay, the development aid resources went in there. If you look at a country like Ivory Coast, almost 70% of Ivory Coast development was concentrated around the capital, Abidjan. The informal sectors and the traditional sectors were neglected.
They don't benefit from that.
Now, if you neglect those sectors, now those are the sectors which produce your food, then it means that Africa can't feed itself.
And you've written a number of times that Africa has the resources it needs
has the
to support
resources
itself
to
and
support
to live
itself.
well.
Yes, precisely.
So are things like micro-lending organizations useful in helping the peasant and the informal economy uplift themselves? In other words, do you skip over governmental contracts and go straight to the individuals?
Okay, micro-lending, microfinance is great in the sense that 2 points here. Number one, it avoids the corrupt and incompetent governments, okay, and tries to deal directly with the informal and the traditional sectors. That's a good point, okay. But microfinance or microcredit finance, okay, the focus is wrong because now remember I indicated in the beginning that in the West, the teleological focal point is the individual. The American says, I am because I am.
I see where you're going, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, in Africa, it's not so much the individual, it is the collective.
Right.
Okay? But somehow, this Western belief is driving microcredit finance to think that, well, if I can help one individual.
Right. But we need to help a tribe or an extended family.
Or you need to help a collective or put in place, okay, systems which will help a collective, okay, not just one individual. Right. And that is when I think that kind of finance will take off. So instead of microfinance, my concept that I'm coming up with is Meso capital. Meso capital.
Tell me about that.
Take fishing, for example, okay, where you have native fishermen, they go out to sea in small, dingy, narrow dugout canoes, okay? If you went, a fishing canoe can be, has a crew of, let's say, 8 fishermen. Okay? If you went out there and gave each one of them, okay, $100, microfinance, okay, what can they do with it? Maybe they might pull their resources together and buy, let's say, a bigger net, okay? But notice something, okay? Look at the size of the canoe. There is a limit to how much fish it can bring. Right. Okay? So, the bigger net may enable them to, purchase.
To minimal help.
Yeah, it's minimal help. All right. Now look upon it. Take a look at what I call Meso capital. Okay? Meso capital would require taking $100,000 and building a bigger boat, okay? Now, a bigger boat, okay, can catch more than 30 times what the small sort of dugout canoe can catch, okay? Now, that bigger boat can replace, let's say, 30 small dugout canoes. The point that I'm trying to stress is that with Meso capital, okay, you can utilize what economists call economies of scale. Okay, because you can go a little bigger, okay? Now, it is Meso capital because we're not talking about millions of dollars. You're only talking about, say, $100,000, okay? Now, the bigger boat, okay, is a step, it's an improvement upon what they already have, but it doesn't come up to, let's say, a modern, fishing vessel type of, technology. Okay, so it is like something like an intermediate technology.
And what you're saying is we shouldn't leap from the small dugout to a big ship, but we should.
But this is exactly what the elites try to do. We did this in Ghana. We set up a state fishing corporation, okay, and imported all this, fancy new, nuclear-powered, trawlers imported from Jupiter. We brought them into Ghana. They worked for a few months, and then they broke down. We abandoned them. All that I'm saying is that, in my book, Africa Unchained, is go back, okay, to the systems that we so-called, quote-unquote, primitive technology, and just build upon them.
My guest today has been George Ayittey, president of the Free Africa Foundation and author of Africa Unchained, the blueprint for Africa's future. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.